So the one thing that I see a lot of guys mess up when they're jig fishing is they miss the bite. They don't actually know when a fish is biting their jig. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why guys stop fishing jigs, because they just don't know when the fish are actually on their bait. Now, I have a really great story about that. I was actually doing an on the water fishing lesson with a guy, and we were on Table Rock Lake. And I was just absolutely hammering him on a football jig. I mean, boom, boom. I think about like 20 fish. I had like 2 or 3 close to 4-pound smallmouth. I mean, 3.5-pound largemouth, just wrecking them. And the guy I was with, he could not get a bite to save his life. He was like, man, I can't get bit. And I was like giving him my rod, casting out there, and he wasn't doing anything. And he was setting the hook a lot. He was like, oh, there's one, and he would miss it. And I thought maybe his hook set was wrong or whatever. Well, about 2/3 of the way through the day, he was just sitting there, and then his rod started bowing. He was like, oh, I'm in a rock. And he starts shaking it like it's a rock, and then a 4-pound smallmouth jumps out of the water and spits his jig. And he's like, oh, that was a fish. I didn't even know it. And what had happened is he was setting the hook on every rock he came in contact with pretty much all day, and he was shaking and trying to get unhung all of the fish that were biting him all day. He was mixing up the fish with the rocks in terms of how they felt. And so he probably had 15 fish that he literally shook off throughout the fishing day. And that's just something that happens a ton with jig fishermen, is that the bite is so much different from a bite on a Texas rig worm or a spinnerbait or a crankbait. The only jig bite that's really kind of obvious to me is like a swim jig bite, where you can either see them or they like absolutely like slam it and you feel it in your rod. Most jig bites are going to be what probably Randy would call like a pressure bite. But what I kind of think about jig bite is really what happens when fish eat a jig is that they come up to your jig, they suck it in, and they just sit there and hold it. And most of the jig bites that I get are not, or when I sense the bite, is not when I actually feel the weight of the fish. Instead, it's usually when I don't feel any weight. It's when you're fishing that jig and you're throwing it down there and you are lifting up, and then all of a sudden you feel less weight than you normally feel when you're lifting up that jig. That's just because those fish have grabbed your jig and have swam up just a little bit, and when you lift up, you kind of feel that weightless feeling. That's about 50% of the jig bites. The next 40% of the jig bites are when you lift up and you just feel it nice and solid, and you keep pulling and it doesn't pull over the top of like a limb or a log. Now there's a little bit of nuance there, because sometimes you can do that and it can be a tree. And I do set the hook on some trees every once in a while, Randy. That's nothing to be ashamed about. But sometimes you feel that, and you'll just feel that kind of nice tension and pull, and sometimes that's going to be a fish as well. But I would say that the bite that a lot of guys miss on that jig is that weightless feeling when they lift up and the jig isn't quite as heavy. And I think the reason that a lot of guys miss these bites is that they're not actually fishing a heavy enough jig to really feel that jig. What I mean by that is when I'm throwing a jig, like an offshore jig, like the Jewel offshore jig, it's a 5/8 ounce bait. I want to make sure that I can feel that bait and feel the bottom, and I want to be making sure I know where that jig is at all times. If you're casting your jig out and you don't actually feel the cover or feel the bottom, usually you're either not on the bottom or you're throwing a jig that's too light for you to sense what's going on. A couple of things you can do to help that is make sure your bait gets the bottom, using fluorocarbon line, and a lot of times using lighter line, like 14-pound, 12 to 14-pound test on your jigs, just at the beginning, so you can really feel that jig on the bottom. And then the last thing is just to throw a jig a lot to get a sense for how heavy that jig is on the end of your rod. And then when you lift up and it feels a little bit lighter, that's when you know you need to set the hook. It's a very nuanced bite. It's not super easy to get a grasp of. That's why you have to spend a lot of time on it. But I would say if you have struggled fishing a jig in the past, 90% chance that the reason you didn't like fishing a jig is because you didn't detect most of the bites you were getting, and you were actually missing those bites. Would you agree with that, Randy?
No doubt, from my experience, that the way you described is pretty much right on. For me, when I'm fishing a jig, there's basically three different types of bites that you get, and the bites that you get, the way that I get them, a lot of it depends on where you're fishing, the type of fish you're fishing for, and how pressured those fish are. Because for me, the three type of jig bites are this. My favorite jig bite, and the one that you get when the fish are not pressured and they're really aggressive, is when you flip or pitch or cast into a particular area and you just see your line jump. That's just, it happens on a jerkbait sometimes like that. When you see your line jump, that means that bass has inhaled that lure from a long distance away, and it's usually a quality fish that has the power to inhale a jig from that distance away. That's the first bite. The second
And how
bite,
often does that
it,
happen, by the way, Randy? Because I feel like for me on a jig, that happens like 5% of the time.
that's not very often. I mean, like I said, that's something that usually happens that on a place that does not get much fishing pressure. But it is my favorite jig bite. It's the
Oh, yeah.
most exciting jig bite there is. The second bite that you get on it is like what Jonny was talking about, where the fish just pick the bait up and they hold it and they don't move with it. Now, to me, this is the most difficult bite to detect because the only way that you can really detect that bite is by putting pressure on that line until you feel movement or not. Because a lot of times you can get, even good anglers will get fooled because if a bass picks that bait up and holds it, you can either pull it and it'll be a rock, like you'll pull it over a rock or a limb, or you'll pull it and you'll start feeling a little bit of surging a little bit with it. And the third type of bite is when you pitch it out there, you work the bait a couple times, and all of a sudden it just feels like it becomes weightless, and your
Mm.
line starts swimming out. Most of the time, those are the three type of jig bites, and this is when the critical, and this is sort of getting away from the topic a little bit, but it's sort of the critical time frame is when you get that bite. It's really important on a jig to set that hook on a tight line, because
Mhm.
what happens if you get one of those bites, say you flip in there and your line jumps, all of a sudden you're all jacked up and you reel down and you set the hook and you'll get slack in that line on a lot of times on a jig hook. And what happens is when you set the hook on a jig, especially a large diameter head, like a half ounce to 1 ounce size head on a jig, if you pulled on that jig and snap it real hard, you actually will you'll force the mouth of that bass open with that jig head. And a lot of times you'll have that bass on for 3 or 4 cranks and it'll come off. So regardless of the type of bite that you get on a jig, don't get in a big hurry. Let the fish swim a little bit with it, tighten up your line and just pull back on a tight line and you'll land a lot more jig fish.
Yep, for sure. Question from Gary. He asks, "Do you mark your brush piles with a fish marker?" I'll sometimes drop a buoy on my brush piles, Gary, but most of the time I just use waypoints. I have a great video on that. Just go to Fish the Moment, how to hit offshore sweet spots every cast, or how to hit offshore spots. Fish the Moment. It's the best video I have on my channel. No one seems to have ever watched it because I get that question more than anything. How do you get your bait on offshore piece of structure? That's if you're fishing a jig and you're not able to get your bait on the brush pile you mark, that's a big problem. So go check out that video. I get that question so much, and I just tell you, type in Fish the Moment, how to hit offshore sweet spots, or how to hit offshore areas. The video will pop up. It's the best video on my channel. Just go check it out. But sorry, Randy, I wanted to get that out there. But yeah, that's good stuff. And I'm gonna make a hook set video here pretty soon, Randy, about how to properly set the hook, because I think a lot of guys are not setting the hook properly. From what I'm seeing, I watch a lot of like random YouTube videos nowadays, and like no one sets the hook very well.
I'll give you guys a little history lesson in the hook setting of jigs. Back in the early 1990s, Gary Klein and I we worked together almost every tournament, hand in hand. In the Bassmaster tournaments. And Gary's a big flipper. I'm a big flipper. And back then we did a lot of flipping together. And we analyzed this whole hook set and how many fish you lost on the jig. And back then, we didn't understand this whole thing about setting on a slack line. Everybody did it. And what we did to counter it back then is we used fiberglass flipping sticks. We actually had 7.5 and 8 foot long fiberglass flipping sticks. And that fiberglass actually, the give on that fiberglass actually allowed us to snap set hard like that, because you didn't have the force of the rod tip to open that fish's mouth up. But it was only after we figured out that you can't snap set on a jig and you have to pull on a jig as to when you started becoming more effective. And we lost a lot of big fish over a course of 5 or 6 years learning that lesson.
Oh man, that's good stuff right there.